Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. We continue our march through the Episcopal hymnal. We're up to 665. Oh, this is a famous one. Yes, set to the tune, Michael. All my hope on God is founded. He doth still my trust renew. Me through change and chance guideth, only good and only true. God unknown, he alone calls my heart to be his own. Sung in a lot of cathedral churches. Well, we open up a study that's going to take us a while. Archaeology in general. Archaeology in Asia Minor, Turkey would probably include the Hittite culture. All kinds of pictures. Archaeology in Mesopotamia, the land out of which Abraham was called. Archaeology in Palestine and Syria. And I'm afraid in our Old Testament studies, my seminary studies, I don't know if I had a course in archaeology or not. We had to learn Hebrew, of course. But this particular article is by Professor William LaSor, a famous Old Testament scholar. Let's see what we can work our way through, muscle our way through. It's archaeology is the scientific study of the material and remains of past human life and activities. It's going to be, it's a wide definition: commerce, literature, even navigation, economics, inscriptions, politics, religion, even architecture. Some of the architecture. Anyways, let's go. The definition, I'm going to work on the definition, materials, geological and cultural levels, the task, method, dating, finds, the finds, archaeology in the Bible, and the evidential value of archaeology. Definition, the word archaeology, British archaeology, is derived from archaeo, which means old. It's a Greek word, and logos, which means word. So it's the orderly arrangement of ancient things, defined broadly to include all study of antiquity. And I think one thing is very useful for Americans, and again, we do Old Testament, New Testament, systematics, church history, practical theology, and we're trying to work over here in contemporary studies. We've opened that up. A lot of work to be done there. Sociology of religion. That even includes politics or the values that end up with certain cultural expressions. I would think relativism and nihilism would be a couple of things where I'm headed theologically. But as for the practical value of archaeology, especially for Americans who don't have much history, we think we have 230 years ago, we have a constitution. We talk about ourselves as if, and then if you're Anglicans, we like the English Reformation, but there's a history before that too. Old Testament studies. It just kind of lets us know we're not the acme of civilization. And as we learn in biblical studies, context for grammatical, historical understanding of the text. I was talking with a student the other day. The one course he's in, all the lectures keep saying context. And it was getting a little wearisome to him. I let him talk, and we talked. And after I said, it's context. Anyways, study of antiquity, and this word is used indeed, found in the works of 19th century Accordingly, subjects included are often more properly covered under physical anthropology or human paleontology. In the narrower sense, which is the scope of this article, archaeology deals with the material remains of human life. It also includes coins. We'll get into maybe that later. Thus, the Zinjanthropus skull, for example, would be more properly studied under anthropology, while stone artifacts found in the vicinity of the study would be treated under archaeology. The distinction obviously is a tenuous one, and overlapping can hardly be avoided. Some scholars limit the study of archaeology to the study of artifactual remains, things that were made by man, while others include non-artifactual materials or those that were used but not made or fashioned. Since non-artifactual materials is a rather unwieldy term, I suggest usequid as a term to indicate anything used but not fashioned by man. Only a scholar would recommend usequid for common language. Oh well, we love our scholars. Biblical archaeology is a specialized branch of archaeology that is devoted to gathering and classification of data that come from or related to areas included in the biblical world and at times pertinent to the biblical story. There's no special technique in biblical archaeology. Indeed, some scholars would deny that there is such a thing as biblical archaeology any more than there are disciplines such as biblical geology or biblical mathematics. And automatically, we register our protests against those scholars. There is no such thing as non-theological discipline. We're reformed. God's in command of all the facts. Theological science, theological botany, theological zoology. We've been studying zoology recently, and I'm becoming a bird lover, a bird watcher. And then I had a little baby cat out here under the pool deck, and I nursed that thing out and fed it. I mean, nature is just glorious. It's theological. History is theological. I realize the Enlightenment Academy says no to all that. But mathematics is theological. They don't like me for saying that. Go to a department of history at Harvard or University of Pennsylvania. They're going to ride you out in a rail at the slightest whiff of religion in history. Well, so be it, you know. Or you go under the radar and assemble the facts, keep God out of it, and then when you get out, you can talk about God if you wish. In other words, Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War should be viewed theologically. I know. Academics are gonna, some of them. There's a quantum physicist whose lectures, forget his name now, is it Julian? He's a believer. And he's theological physicist. You know, the doctors in our congregation are theological medical doctors. We got a lot of doctors in our church, but I don't know what they come from all over, friends and this. Anyways, definitional disturbances early on. We'll let it rest. The difference, however, lies not in the methods or results, but in the definition of purpose. Just as there are valid studies of biblical metrology, that is, those weights and measures that are specifically mentioned in the Bible, and biblical Hebrew, the specific kinds of Hebrew that are used in the Bible, so there is a valid limitation of archaeology to shed light on the social and political structures the religious concepts and practices, and other human activities and relationships that are found in the Bible or pertain to people in the Bible. But again, historical studies are warranted on the grounds of the third commandment. What is the third commandment? Third commandment is, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that takes his name in vain. What's required in the third commandment? We teach our children, which we were nursed on. Third commandment requires the holy, reverent use of all God's names, titles, works, plural, and word. So under this thing of works, we include history. God's in command of the historical stuff. And history to him is a half second long. 1 second. Half a second is before Christ. The other half second is after Christ. We got little tiny brains. And so we're disrespectful if we look down upon history as an area. Doesn't mean you're a historian. You might be a medical doctor or a lawyer. But it does mean that you appreciate history and say historical studies are a part of providence. Even we're studying Babylonian, Upper Sumerian, Lower Sumerian, 2000 BC. We're not talking about Abraham. We want archaeological and historical stuff to be done. So we don't disrespect God. We don't take his name in vain. And you can see where the third commandment has been appropriately understood. We're not anti-intellectuals. We're just the reverse. That does not mean you're an academic. You might be a welder or an electrician. That's fine. Be a good one. You might be a teacher, an engineer. Might be the guy cutting my grass out here. We love them all. But no anti-intellectualism. So we say that in connection here, even if it's not studying biblical archaeology, but we're over there studying, what's going on in the Indus Valley in India, place where Alexander the Great ran around. So we approach it per se with our presuppositions. We don't leave Old Testament, New Testament, systematic church history at the door. When we step into a field, we bring our package. So let's proceed. Enough introduction from me, and let's get back to the better voice, Professor LaSor. But just as it is difficult, if not impossible, to decide where to draw the line between archaeology and physical archaeology, so it is to establish the limits of biblical archaeology. In Egypt, for example, the first biblical situation is in the time of Abraham, Genesis 12:10. And we're given details of Egyptian life only in the time of Joseph. But it's unrealistic to start our study of the material remains of man in Egypt at only one of these 2 points. For the cultural level of Egypt in Joseph's day had its own antecedents. Pyramids were already up. And Egyptian archaeology, as it contributes to our understanding of the closing portion of Genesis and the opening chapters of Exodus, must include some of those elements. Again, Moses, schooled. My working theory has been for a long time. He was schooled in law, Egyptian literature, political life, cultural life. Probably visited the pyramids, we might say inferentially. Perfect sense. He wasn't a rhubarb who went out, a great following, mass following out of Egypt. political, military, theological event under the command of His Majesty. That's it. We want to know, for example, what evidence there is of merchant caravans traveling from Canaan to Egypt, travel routes. How did Joseph get sold into Egyptian life? What was the social structure of Egypt and the status of slaves? We want to know something about the divining cup of Genesis 44, many other details to help us understand the biblical account. Now, of course, if you're a narcissist, you don't want to know any of that. You just want to open the Bible and get a little thrill, a little uplift. Yeah, the Bible has therapy in it. We're studying psychiatry and the gospel. But we come at this, and we're quiet for a while. We listen to back to the professor, let him go back to talking. It helps us understand the Bible. As the biblical scholar searches for such details, he finds himself going back and further back in the findings reported by the Egyptian archaeologists. Where does he stop? Usually this is determined by the time and patience he has and money. It takes money to do this, rather than by some definition of the limits of his discipline. Biblical archaeology, then, is the study of any of the material remains of human activity that may properly be used to shed further light on the biblical story. Now, I suspect professional archaeologists are going to want to widen that out and say, yeah, the Bible's part has its place and role, but we do it for the other reasons we noted, i.e. providence. We're talking about archaeology, little one. Got my little granddaughter. She's as happy as can be, tooling around. Yeah, you're 8 months old. We're talking about stuff that's 5,000, 6,000, 8,000 years old, little kid. Materials. According to our definition, anything made by man, an artifact, or used by him, a usequid, is properly a subject for study by the archaeologist. Artifacts include tools, household utensils, furnishings, ornaments, buildings, weapons, fortifications, sculpture, paintings, mosaic, and all other things fashioned by man. Usequids include such things as bones, shells, teeth, etc., of animals who serve for food or other domestic purposes. Traces of plants that were cultivated or collected for food, weaving, basket making, and other purposes, but not the finished item, which is an artifact. Mineral items, such as semi-precious stones, used for decorative or other purposes. A special category, which some scholars, Braidwood, would not consider under archaeology, includes any kind of written material. I think because of our definition of providence, we would include written material, but they want to debate over definitions, let them debate. I mean, cuneiforms, Rosetta Stone, and all that stuff. So it does not include that. Whether carved in stone, impressed in clay, stamped in metal, written with ink or papyrus or parchment. The list is long, grows longer as our knowledge of the past and our areas of interest expand. And the many items requires high levels of specialization. Accordingly, modern archaeological excavations generally are done by groups or teams of scholars that include experts in many fields. Several subdivisions of materials have been suggested. Quite frequently, these follow the peculiar interest of the person making the division. For example, we might separate the materials that remain above ground, such as the pyramids, the Parthenon, the Colosseum. Colosseum is pretty modern. Parthenon's kind of modern compared to the pyramids, is it not? Would Troy be modern compared to the pyramids? Just questioning. From those that have been excavated from the earth, such as Sargon's palace, Khorsabad, or Pompeii. It's a nice place, Pompeii, to visit. I've got the kids there a couple times. Or we might distinguish between prehistoric and historic remains, which would require a definition of our terms. Or we might simply separate artifactual from non-artifactual materials. We're in a definitional combat here. A logomachy, I guess. It's a nice Greek word nobody uses much. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it right. Any method has advantages and disadvantages. Perhaps the greatest disadvantage is that artificial fragmentation of a very complex subject and the resulting tendency to ignore what lies outside one's own special interests. It's going to be true. That's why we insist upon this comprehensive. It's a big hermeneutic. The biblical archaeologist, for example, could never dismiss the documentary remains as lying outside his field, for without the religious, legal, historical, and other writings recovered in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Ras Shamra, or Bog Hazor, I think that's in the Hittite area, to mention a few places. The interpretation of other data and interpretation of the Bible itself would be filled with all sorts of fantasy. In a very definite way, documentary materials of archaeology provide the necessary controls for interpreting much of the other data. Fascinating. One has only to recall the strange interpretations that were placed on Egyptian archaeological materials prior to the decipherment of Egyptian inscriptions. Geological and cultural levels. A person coming to the study of archaeology for the first time finds himself encountering a large number of unfamiliar terms, or familiar terms used in unfamiliar ways. Geologists refer to the last million years of the Earth's history as the Pleistocene epoch, which extended from 1 million BP, before the present, to about 11,000 BP, and the Holocene epoch since about 11 BP, which is 9,000 BC. During the Pleistocene, there were alternating periods of advance and retreat of the great ice sheets that covered the northern latitudes. The periods of extensive glaciation are generally called by the names that originated in the Alps: Gunz, Mindel, Riss, Würm glacial periods. With the last ice age, the Würm, the Pleistocene ended and the Holocene began. Anthropologists distinguish the cultural levels of man with terms such as Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, Mesolithic, Middle Stone Age, and Neolithic, the New Stone Age. The principal characteristic distinguishing the new stage from the old stage is the fact during the old stage, man was a food gatherer, a hunter, and a fisher, Whereas the new stage, man became a food producer, having cultivated cereals and domesticated cattle. The Paleolithic age, and there's some arbitrariness in that, in my estimation, but we'll move on. The Paleolithic age lies within the Pleistocene epoch, and the Neolithic age began in Europe, Asia, Africa, approximately with the Holocene epoch, in other words, about 9,000 BC. Some scholars would reduce this to 8,000 BC. It appears obvious from passages such as Genesis 2:19, 4:2, 4:20 to 22, that the life situation, or the sits in Laban, of the earliest portions of biblical history is the New Stone Age. This would seem to provide a reasonable beginning point for biblical archaeology. While it may be interesting to study the bifacial tool traditions of Abavilian and Acheulean, and the flood tool traditions of Clactonian and Levalloisian cultural levels of the second and third interglacial periods, it is open to serious question whether these areas of study make any significant contribution to the study of the Bible. At best, we conclude that the Old Stone Age was one of the final steps of God's creative activity before he created man in his own image. Maybe we will stop with that. Verse 2 of hymn 665. Mortal pride and earthly glory, sword and crown betray our trust. Though with care and toil we build them, tower and temple fall to dust. But God's power, hour by hour, is my temple and my tower. Let us pray. Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power, riches, wisdom, and strength, and honor, glory, and blessing. Amen. Until next time, Godspeed.